Hi, everyone. Welcome to the On-Farm Produce Safety Training. We're joined today by Sara Runkel from the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, as she's going to talk to us about some regulations that are helpful and important for your operation, whether or not they apply to you, and how to determine whether or not they apply to you. So we're going to do a presentation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Sara for her presentation.
And help you figure out whether or not you're covered by that rule or not. And then also talk about good agricultural practices and gap audits, and then what the similarities and differences are between the two. And then I'll provide you with some additional resources if you want more training on food safety for your operation or for the farmers that you work with. So before we get into the regulations, I just want to remind folks, how important food safety is for everybody, right? As a farmer, you're a food handler. It applies to all growers, and Salmonella and E. coli don't discriminate whether you're a large farm or a small farm, if you're conventional or organic, right? They're in the environment and can show up at any operation. Food safety regulations are not a new thing. So the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act of 1938 has been in place for a long time, and that has prohibited the introduction of adulterated food into commerce, right? And so, any food producer should not be putting contaminated produce out or foods out into the marketplace. And as a farmer, we're growing other people's food, and so we need to be aware of the food safety risks that are out there and how to manage them so that we're providing our customers with food that is safe, as much as that's under our control. We never say that you can 100% guarantee that produce is safe, but you can implement management practices to reduce that risk. Lots of folks get sick from foodborne illness. I don't know if anybody here has ever knows that they've had a foodborne illness or known anybody with a foodborne illness. I don't know, maybe a quick show of hands, or if you've gotten sick. I know I never was diagnosed. I didn't go to the doctor for it, but we got very sick from a raw milkshake once on a farm that I was working on. So, most folks, if you've had the 24-hour flu or stomach bug, that is some kind of foodborne illness. So these statistics are a little old. These are from the CDC from 2011, but 1 in 6 Americans get sick from foodborne illness, kind of across all the different types of foods. But a lot of those are associated with contaminated fresh produce. So if you're thinking about like all of the potential foods that people could get sick from, 46% of those illnesses are traced back to contaminated produce, and 23% of deaths come from eating contaminated produce. All right. So when talking to farmers about produce safety, I like to make the business case, right, of why it's so important to, of all the hats that you have to wear as a farmer, make sure that you're also paying attention to food safety on the farm, right? So you're implementing these best practices for your customers. We hear from a lot of growers, right, like, I've always done it this way and I've never gotten anyone sick, right? That you know of. The way that the traceback system works and outbreaks, right? Like, a lot of those 1 in 6 illnesses are never actually traced back to root cause, a particular product. The traceback process takes a long time. The goal is to not have an outbreak associated with your products and to keep your customers safe. It's also an important, customer facing part of your operation that you should be proud of. There are, buyers that require food safety audits, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But even if you're selling direct to consumer, right? Like communicating with your customers, your commitment to food safety um, is something that you should be proud of, and is something that is a marketable attribute, just as if you were growing organically, um, or other attributes that are important to your customers. Communicating what you're doing related to food safety can be a good business practice. So in addition to that business case, right? I mean, produce safety, what we're really talking about is keeping pathogens, which are not visible, from contaminating your produce. So whether it's bacteria like E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, there are other bacteria that can contaminate produce as well, but those are the most common ones, or a virus or a parasite. Um, you can't see those when they're on the produce. So it's really about understanding what the risks are, and then implementing practices to manage those risks. By doing that, you are protecting your customers, but also protecting your farm and your farm assets. Hopefully, nobody here has ever been involved in a recall associated with their farm, and hopefully you'll keep it that way, right? It can be really damaging to not only your farm, but also the broader industry. Um, I don't know if folks remember the cantaloupe outbreak that happened in Colorado a number of years ago, but that was linked to one farm, but it impacted the whole cantaloupe industry in Colorado. Um, and implementing food safety practices, especially if you go through a third-party audit, can help you access additional markets that require those certifications. All right. So in the previous slide, I talked about the biological contaminants. In the broad picture of food safety, we also think about chemical contaminants as well as physical contaminants, as potentially impacting the safety of your food. So thinking about sources for biological contamination, right? These can be your soil amendments, especially if you're using animal-based soil amendments, ones that are not treated, potential sources of contamination from pests, whether it's insects, rodents, other wildlife, domestic animals, equipment cross-contamination, and workers, right? Like everybody who comes into contact with that produce is a potential source of contamination. Uh, Chemical contaminants, I think most folks think of like pesticides and herbicides as a contamination source, but it's also important to remember that the chemicals that you use for cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces or wash water, if those are not used appropriately, could also be a source of contamination. Allergens are another type of chemical contaminant. So if you're on a farm that grows produce and also handles or produces products like tree nuts or peanuts or eggs, right? Wheat products, dairy products, those are all allergens that can make people sick, and are considered a chemical contaminant. And then our physical contaminants, right? So broken glass from lights in your pack shed, or wood splinters. I was told a story about a farm. They had customer complaints about staples in their salad mix, and it turns out they were stapling labels to their reusable plastic totes, to keep track of when stuff was harvested as part of their traceability system, and then they'd pull those labels off. Um, the staples wouldn't always come off with the label, and would eventually fall out over time into the product. So that could cause injury or harm to a customer if they were to eat that. So those contamination sources can cause injury or harm, and in some cases even death. When we talk about farm food safety, you may be familiar with this term good agricultural practices. And it encompasses a whole set of practices that you implement on the farm to reduce that possibility of contaminating your produce. So, looking at direct as well as indirect contamination sources, we talked about the different types physical, chemical, and biological. So there's kind of like lowercase good agricultural practices, which are the foundation of farm food safety. And then there's the actual good agricultural practices or food safety audits that I'll get into more detail later in the presentation. GAPs cover pretty much everything that you do on the farm, right? So everything from worker health and hygiene. And when I say workers, that's not just like employees, that also includes volunteers or family members, really anyone on the farm who's working with your produce, making sure those workers are trained properly. Water is a big area for risk management. So the water that you use in growing the crop, and then water that you use during harvest and post-harvest activities. So, when you're washing the produce, the types of soil amendments that you use, as well as any agricultural chemicals. Also thinking about water that you might be using to mix those agricultural chemicals. Wild and domestic animals, how they might impact the safety of your produce and be a potential source of contamination or cross-contamination. Your harvest and post-harvest practices, as well as the equipment that you use on the farm, cleaning and sanitation, thinking through land use. So both like what has the land that you're growing on been used for in the past? So understanding, was there an orchard there? Is there potential chemical contamination in the soil? Do you have adjacent land uses, whether it's on your own property, right? Like maybe you have livestock on your farm as well as produce, or maybe you have a neighbor that has livestock, right? And is there a potential for runoff or windblown contamination from those animals and their manure? And then traceability. So being able to trace your product one step back. So what field it was harvested from and what was applied to that field. And one step forward, who did you sell that product to? GAP certification programs, these are market driven. So does anybody here have a GAP audit or been asked by a buyer about a GAP audit? Typically, if you're selling into wholesale, or if you're selling, a lot of states, if you're selling into school systems, they require that you have a third-party food safety audit. There are a lot of acronyms related with GAP audits. So USDA does a lot of these audits. So the USDA GAP, which was also known as GAP GIP, so good agricultural practices / good handling practices. There's a USDA group GAP program, which you can actually either do group GAP for kind of the basic GAP or the harmonized GAP. Harmonized GAP plus. So the harmonized GAP standard aligns with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requirements, which we're going to talk about. And then the harmonized GAP plus is Global Food Safety Initiative technical equivalency. So this is typically like Walmart requires this, big growers, and if you're exporting produce. And then larger buyers will sometimes require a global GAP or a Primus audit. So, you hear about GAP certification, but it's really important to understand what your buyer wants, because these are not all the same. And this is expensive to get a GAP audit. It has to happen every year to maintain your status. And so because it is buyer driven, making sure you know what you need to do to meet those buyer requirements before you get started is really important. We do a lot of technical assistance with growers, helping them get certified. We do a lot of work with farmers that are scaling up from direct to consumer sales to getting into wholesale. So just outlining the steps to getting GAP certified, right? You have to have a written food safety plan specific to your farm and the audit that you're obtaining. And so there are lots of templates out there. Don't feel like you need to start from scratch. Um, Once you have the plan, you have to actually implement it. And there are records that you need to keep um, throughout the year on your practices, making sure that employees are trained, having your water sources tested. You have to complete a self audit using the standards. So, kind of going through making sure that uh, you are meeting the requirements of the standard before you have your audit. Doing a mock recall, so making sure that your traceability system is working, and then you actually schedule and have an auditor come and verify your food safety plan and your practices. Typically, GAP audits are conducted by your state Department of Agriculture. If you're doing a USDA GAP audit, typically there's someone at your state Department of Agriculture who would actually come out and do that audit. The other audits like Global Gap and Primus, there are other independent auditors that you can pay to come do that audit on your farm. Okay, so now we're going to jump into talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act. And thanks, Emma, for sharing some links in the chat. How many folks have heard of FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act? I see some hands coming up. Yeah. So FSMA has been around for a while now. Like I said, we've had food safety federal requirements since 1938 with the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, but FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, was signed into law in 2011. Once it was signed into law, there was a bunch of rulemaking and comments on the rules, and then the Produce Safety Rule, which is what we're going to talk about today, was finalized in 2016, but inspections didn't actually start until 2019. The Produce Safety Rule is, other than the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, is really the first time that like the FDA has had authority to go out to produce farms and inspect them and enforce certain practices on farms that are covered. And we're going to talk about how to understand whether you're covered by the rule or not here in a second. The Food Safety Modernization Act now has 8 rules. The food traceability rule was recently added. We are just going to talk about the produce safety rule. I don't know if in the Food Hub presentation, if there was any mention of the preventative controls for human food rule. Yeah, great. So that covers processing activities. So if you're manufacturing food, or if you're not a farm and you're, packing and holding produce in a warehouse type situation, you might fall under the preventative controls rule. So we are going to focus on talking about the produce safety rule. But you can see it also covers animal food, foreign supplier verification. There's lots of parts to FSMA. The produce safety rule is this federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. When this rule was written, they really wanted to focus on taking a preventative approach to food safety versus a reactionary approach. And so it's really written to focus on how to manage risk related to biological contamination on the farm. So you're probably wondering, how am I affected by the produce safety rule, right? So you're like, oh no, I've got to comply with this new rule. We're going to get into that. We'll talk about, how to decide what your exemption status is, if it applies to your farm, We'll talk about what produce is included in the rule. Not all produce is covered by the rule. If you are exempt or qualified exempt, what you have to do. And then we're not going to get into the weeds on what you have to do if you are covered by the rule, but I will share some resources with you so that you can learn more about that. But whether or not you're covered by the produce safety rule, remember that produce safety is a responsibility of every. So before we get into talking about coverage and exemptions, just some definitions. This is a lot of words on the screen, but it's important to understand that, the rule has a glossary. They have all these very specific definitions. And the produce safety rule applies to activities that you do on the farm, right? So whether you're a primary production farm or a secondary activities farm, which is basically like it's mainly owned by a farm, but might not be in the same location. And it's an area where you're doing activities like hulling or shelling, packing, holding raw agricultural products. So understanding whether or not you're a farm or not is kind of the first step to understanding whether you're covered by the rule. If you're not in a farm, so for example, if you're a food hub that's not also growing food, then you would not be, the produce safety rule would not apply to you. You would have to look at the preventative controls. So there are three categories of farms that relate to the produce safety rule. You can either be not covered by the rule, qualified exempt, or covered by the rule. When we're looking at exemptions and qualified exemptions, this monetary exemption is really important. So these numbers here on the screen are adjusted for inflation every year. The new numbers typically come out in April. We'll see if those come out on time this year, but you're looking at the past, the average of your sales over the past 3 years. And you're exempt from the rule if over the past 3 years, your gross produce sales are less than $31,925. So this is the 2021 through 2024 timeframe. If you are exempt from the rule, then there's no compliance necessary with the rule. We do recommend that you keep some records so that you can verify that exemption. States that have a cooperative agreement with the FDA are developing farm inventories. So you may have already gotten a call from someone at your Department of Ag that's managing the produce safety program, or you might be hearing from one. They want to know what your status is under the rule so that they can decide whether or not they need to come do an inspection on your farm. The next qualified exemption, there's a much bigger range. So if you're over that 31.9 number, but under 638,279 of all food sales, and we're going to get into those definitions in a second, you're qualified exempt if 51% of those sales are to qualified end users. And you're probably pulling your hair out right now, like, what does all of this mean? A qualified end user would be like direct to consumer sales, right? So farmers market, CSA sales. It also includes sales to restaurants, retail food establishments in your state or no further than 275 miles. You do have to sell directly to the store that is selling that produce. So you couldn't sell to like a distribution center for a grocery chain and that be considered a qualified end user. You'd have to sell it to the actual individual store that's selling that produce. These adjusted for inflation numbers, I said, are updated every year. They are available on the FDA website, and I'll share that link with Emma. She can send it out after the presentation. So the fully exempt, it's gross sales from produce. qualified exempt is gross sales from all food. So you might be asking, like, what's the difference between produce and food? So produce is any fruit or vegetable, which includes mushrooms, sprouts. It also includes things like peanuts and tree nuts and herbs. Sorry. Whereas food is all human and animal food, including seeds used for sprouts. So say you were a diversified farm and you sell hay as animal feed, and then you also grow produce, right? So that would all be combined to look at your total food sales number. Or if you have an on-farm store and you're bringing in product from other farmers and you're selling meat and you're selling dairy and you're also selling your produce, those would be included under all of your food sales. So making that distinction between your produce sales, and that's all produce, and total food sales is important to understand. We're going to look at a list in the next slide of types of produce that are exempt from the rule. And so there are crops that are not covered by the rule. Everything else is covered by the produce safety rule, including sprouts, which have specific additional requirements. There's a whole separate section of the produce safety rule related to sprouts. There is a distinction between sprouts and microgreens. And so if folks have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. A covered farm is a farm that has to abide by the rule. It's not, so you're subject to the rule. And then a qualified exempt farm, you're meeting certain criteria so that you're partially exempt from the produce safety rule. But there are a couple things that you have to do on an annual basis if you're qualified exempt. So this is the exhaustive list of produce that is exempt from the produce safety rule. And so this is sometimes referred to as the rarely consumed raw list. So this list was put together when the rule was written, based on kind of consumer data and how people consume different products. And if you only grow produce on this list, then you are not covered by the rule, even if you grow $1 million worth of cranberries. That's not covered by the produce safety rule. There is also an enforcement discretion for hops, wine grapes, pulse crops, and almonds. So while those are not on this list, the FDA is not enforcing the rule for growers that are only growing hops, wine grapes, pulses, or almonds. Okay. If you've determined that you're qualified exempt, these are the requirements. So you have to label your product or your invoice or have labeling at the point of sale that clearly displays your farm name and complete business address. So that can be on your farmer's market sign. It could be a little, tabletop sign that you put out at your farmer's market sign or your roadside stand. It can be on your labels of your boxes of produce that go out. It could be on your invoice, but you do have to do this labeling. And then you have to keep records proving your qualified exemption. So examples of these types of records would be invoices, so that you can show like how much of your product you sold to a qualified end user or not. And then you need to do an annual review verifying your qualified end user status. Your Schedule F is also a record that you can use, showing your gross sales on the farm. However, if your farm is linked to an outbreak, it gives the FDA the ability to withdraw that qualified exemption regardless of your gross income. There are a couple of other exemptions from the rules. So there is a commercial processing exemption. So if, say, you're growing tomatoes and they're all going to a processor where they're getting made into tomato sauce, If you get documentation from that processor, you would fall under the commercial processing exemption. Other examples of commercial processing would be like distilling, refining, anything that has a kill step. There's a personal consumption exemption. So any produce that you grow on the farm that you use for personal consumption on the farm is not covered by the rule. And that could include if you're, growing product to do your value added step. If you can verify that there's a kill step, you kind of fall under both. But like any food you're growing for yourself falls under that personal consumption. Tribal lands are a little tricky. Tribal lands are considered sovereign territory, and so tribes can request a variance from the full requirements of the rule. That's something done by the tribal Department of Ag or government. And I would encourage folks, if you do work with any tribal growers, reach out to the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, which is based out of the University of Arkansas. They have a lot of good resources for tribal producers related to food safety. Okay, Emma, how am I doing on time?
Maybe about 10 more minutes. Can you do that?
Okay, perfect.
All and right. I'll put these links in the chat right now also.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a couple of tools that you can use to figure out whether you're exempt or qualified exempt. Most of the growers that we work with are smaller growers. I don't know if anybody here knows whether they're covered by the rule or not. If you're willing to share that in the chat. Or if you are uncertain of your status after this quick talk, let me see if I can open this decision tree. Let me stop sharing for a second. Okay. So FDA has this not very nice to look at, but useful decision tree that can help you decide where you stand under the produce safety rule. Let me enlarge that. So if you're a farm, right, do you grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce? So I'm hoping everybody on this call does some produce growing, right? Does your farm on average over the past 3 years, at this point, that number has been adjusted for inflation, right? So now we're at 36,000, right? Or less in annual produce sales. So if you have less than that amount, you're not covered by the rule. But if you have more, the next step is, do you only grow produce that's on the rarely consumed raw list? Okay. If you do, then you're not covered by the rule. If you grow other produce, then you go to the next step. Is all of that produce for personal or on-farm consumption? Or is some of that? So if some of that produce is just for personal consumption, then that produce isn't covered by the rule, but the produce that you sell might be covered. Is that produce intended for commercial processing? If it's yes, then you're eligible for the processing exemption. If no, then you look to see whether or not you might qualify for the qualified exemption. So if you have more than $638,297 in annual food sales, and you grow more than $31,000 worth of produce, then that produce would be covered by the rule. But if you fall in that window between the 31,000 and the 638, if most of your sales are to a qualified end user, then you would be qualified exempt. Make sense, folks? Okay. All right. So hopefully you have a little more clarity on where you stand with the rule and the resources that you can share with growers. back. Sorry, I have too many screens open. Okay, here we go. All right, we talked about the produce, about these exemptions. Okay, if you're familiar with the produce safety rule, you might have heard a lot recently about pre-harvest water. So last summer, they released the final rule related to the requirements for pre-harvest water, also referred to as production water. So that's any water that you use for irrigation or crop sprays or frost protection, anything that you're using before harvest. So there are some new compliance dates related to pre-harvest water if you're covered by the rule. If you're covered by the rule, compliance dates for the rest of the rule have passed. So you need to be in compliance regardless of the size of your operation. So whether you're a very small business, or a large business, all those other compliance dates have passed. So if you're covered by the rule, you need to be doing what's required by the rule. And you may have already had an inspection from your state produce safety program, or in some cases, FDA is doing inspections in states like Oregon, where the state has not set up its own inspection program. If folks are covered by the rule and you're like, oh no, what do I do now? I'll share some resources at the end. The Produce Safety Alliance is the go-to place for information about the produce safety rule. They have the required training for supervisors, and they have a lot of good resources for farms to help you understand what you need to do if you're covered. Okay, so there are some similarities between GAPS and the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. They all address risk management related to food safety in these different areas, right? Worker health and hygiene, equipment, buildings, sanitation, animals, water, biological soil amendments of animal and human origin, traceback, recall ready programs. There's a star there because the produce safety rule under FSMA doesn't have any traceability requirements, but there's this new traceability rule under FSMA that might apply to your operation. So quickly running through similarities and differences. Okay, so the FSMA Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule is the law. So if you're covered by the rule, you have to be in compliance. Good agricultural practices or GAP certification is a market access tool, and those are voluntary. There are exemptions for the produce safety rule. Good agricultural practices can apply to any size farm and any produce crop that you're growing. And you don't necessarily have to have a GAP audit for every crop that you're growing. So if you're a highly diversified farm, but you're just growing watermelons for wholesale and those need to be GAP audited, then you could just have a GAP audit on your watermelons and not the rest of your produce. When it comes to the produce safety rule, there are inspections. These are typically announced to the farmer in advance by someone from your Department of Ag Produce Safety Program. There are no fees involved. Although I wouldn't, some people like to say that the inspections are free, but they take your time, right? So as a farmer, they're not exactly free. And inspectors have been told that they should be educating before they regulate. So their role is as an inspector, and they are there to enforce the law, but they should also be providing some education if needed to the farmer. The GAP audit is only conducted after the grower, has requested that service and set a date, and you have to pay for that audit. That audit fee applies whether you pass your audit or not. So it's really in a grower's best interest to be well prepared for that audit and have all your ducks in a row so that you pass the audit and you're not out a lot of money. The Produce Safety Rule applies to raw agricultural commodities that are normally consumed raw. So anything, any produce, except if it's on that rarely consumed raw list, versus good agricultural practices, you could have a gap audit for any produce, including produce that would be on that rarely consumed raw list, like sweet potatoes or okra. Under the produce safety rule, farms do not need to have a food safety plan, but there is required record keeping. Versus under a GAP certification, those audits all require that you have a written food safety plan, and there are typically additional records required on top of what would be required as part of the produce safety rule. So even if you're not covered by the rule, you might have a buyer asking you for a GAP audit, right? So, and in some cases you're covered by the rule and you're already doing a lot of things that will help you pass a GAP audit. Okay, so here are some additional resources. If you need some light reading, you can read the produce safety rule on the FDA website, but they do have some decent fact sheets and kind of summaries to help you understand the rule a little bit better. If you're looking for resources to share with farmers, if you're not familiar with the Food Safety Resource Clearinghouse, I would highly encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of great resources that have been developed over the years by Extension and nonprofits and other folks helping farmers and producers with food safety. And that is a searchable database. The Produce Safety Alliance manages the PSA training. They have a lot of good resources. And your state extension service likely is doing PSA trainings. There are also online trainings of that available. That is a 7 to 8 hour training, and that gets into all the details of what you have to do if you're covered by the rule, as well as general good agricultural practices to manage food safety risks across your operation. And then if you're interested in learning more about GAP audits, the USDA GAP program website has information about the different types of audits that the USDA offers. And folks are also welcome to reach out to me if you have questions. CFSA is hosting a webinar series that starts next week that goes into details of navigating a harmonized GAP audit. So if you're thinking about pursuing GAP certification, we will talk about food safety risk management, and then each of the classes we go into detail about the different parts of a GAP audit. And that's free. Anyone can register, even if you're not in the Carolinas. And there's my email address if folks have questions that aren't answered. I think we have some time for Q&A. I know that it can sometimes seem a little overwhelming. It's really important to, understand where you fall when it comes to the law, but also recognize how important food safety is to implement on your farm, whether or not you are covered by the produce safety rule or are going for a third-party food safety audit. No one wants to make their customers sick. And there are a lot of factors that can arise that can introduce contaminants into the food system. And so really understanding, what those are and how you can manage those risks and being able to apply a food safety lens to your operation and communicate that with everyone across the operation so that everybody that's working on your farm understands the importance of managing food safety risks on the farm is really important. So there are lots of great resources out there that get into all the details about how to do worker training and health and hygiene and soil amendments and water and you know the PSA training is an 8-hour training on all of that. But there are lots of great resources out there to help you think through that for your own operation.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. That was awesome. Um, and I'll just say that all those resources that Sarah shared, I will send out again to everybody, to all registrants. I'll also send out her contact information and a recording of this as well. So if you didn't take exhaustive notes as you were going, you'll get everything again. Um, we're going to go into a little bit of Q&A, and as I have something, a question asked from the chat, but think of some things, you can put them in the chat, and then in a minute we can invite you to come off mute and ask Sarah some questions. I will just say, I don't know if anybody who's here was at McKenna's training last week, but she talked a little bit about GAP. She runs a food hub. We were talking about food hubs and working with small scale producers. And some of the producers that they work with are exempt or qualified exempt. They're really small scale, but it's really important to their food hub that they know that they're growing food safely. And so GAP audits are a really big piece of that. So that kind of ties into what we learned today. So I want to ask, we got one question in the chat that I'm going to bring up to Sarah. So this is an organization that gleans from farms. So they're working on farms or getting produce from farms, then they're bringing it into their organization. So they're wondering kind of where they fall in this.
That is a good question. That's one of those weird gray areas. Like the the farm that they're gleaning from would need to determine where they fall under the rule. But as a gleaner, right, like you're not selling that product, right? You're like gleaning and then giving it away. Um, so it's hard to like attribute the sales value to it to determine whether you fall under the produce safety rule or not. If you are gleaning on farms that are covered by the rule or who have a GAP audit, they should have some sort of food safety training for everybody that's coming on the farm to glean. And even if they're not covered by the rule or under a GAP audit, I would encourage you to implement some food safety practices for the gleaners. Thinking about, food contact surfaces. So what kind of containers are folks harvesting into? How are you transporting that product? Where are folks washing their hands, using the restrooms when they're out on the farm gleaning? Yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of it is also the responsibility of the farm to
Yeah.
have. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I assume it's a CFP grantee, so I assume a lot of it is not being sold. So yeah, there's not sales associated with that.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat. Um, do you know if the standards for getting food from school gardens into cafeterias are national? Do they vary based on local state governments?
I think they vary from state to state.
Okay, got
Yeah.
it.
Depending on the school food program, there are national requirements in the USDA school food program and like the contracts for kind of larger vegetable procurement under the USDA food program, but I know that like GAP requirements vary from state to state, and then states also have um, different thoughts about utilizing school garden produce in the cafeteria.
Okay.
So I don't know what state uh, that question came from. If you have a state farm to school organization, or maybe your extension service has a farm to school program, they should be able to help you figure out what those specific requirements are in your state.
Okay. Natasha says they have a U-pick orchard. Will they need to do food safety training for people who are picking in the orchard?
It depends on how much they're selling, right? Whether they're covered or not. So if they're selling, if they do U-Pick and they're selling over that 600 plus thousand a year of food, then uh, they would be covered. If you're qualified exempt, right, then you don't have to do food safety training, but it's a good idea. So,
Okay, it sounds
um,
like they are qualified exempt, Natasha.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of U-Pick, some basic food safety stuff for U-Pick operations, right, is like accessible bathrooms, hand washing facilities, communicating with customers about pets, whether or not people can bring pets to the operation, um, what kind of containers people are picking into. Are you providing the containers for them to pick into, and how are you keeping those clean? Or are customers bringing their own containers um, to pick into? Those are some common kind of U-Pick operation. And then also like, how do you manage people in your orchard or your U-Pick operation so they're not potentially going to other areas of the farm where they could be inadvertently contaminating produce? So with apple orchards, the other thing to inform people about is like not picking up apples from the ground because those are a higher contamination risk.
Does anybody have any questions they want to come off mute for and ask?
I saw a couple in the chat that I can address. Kelsey asked about tribal lands being exempt. My understanding is that the tribe has to request a variance, so you're not automatically exempt, but your tribe has to um, submit a request for variance from the FDA. And I would encourage you to reach out to Indigenous Food and Ag folks if you haven't already. They have lawyers on staff who help um, tribal growers. Uh, and then there's a question here about elderberries. Yeah, so if you're making a shelf-stable elderberry blueberry juice, if you're processing those, you should have had that go through some sort of process authority approval. So as long as you can document that that's a kill step, um, and that you're following that approved process every time, then those would fall under that processing exemption.
Any other questions? Yeah, Hester, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't get the button off on. Uh, so I was required as an aggregator, I was required to verify that all of the farms that I work with have participated in GAP. And I just asked verbally, do they have a certificate they can show or like that they can show that they're qualified exempt? For instance, like they have to show me what their income was, like what would qualify as like demonstrating that they have participated.
Yeah, so um, remember that there's a difference between the produce safety rule requirements and exemptions and a gap audit. So if you have a buyer asking you to verify that your growers are gap certified, that's that voluntary inspection. And so that's an annual process. They would need to have a food safety plan, pay for a gap audit, and then they should have a certificate that they can show you. Or if they're audited through the USDA has a public website that lists all of the farms that are currently in good standing with their gap audit. So you can look that up as well. That's different than if you have a buyer wanting you to verify whether or not your farms are in compliance with the produce safety rule or not. Does that make sense? So if they're just asking for gap compliance, then you would want verification from the grower that they've passed a gap audit and they should have a certificate for that. And you wouldn't need to know what their, sales are or anything related to the exemptions or qualified exemptions of the produce safety rule.
Yeah, that answers the question. It was really just they said the requirement is that they had to all have participated in GAP. So I needed to know, like, how would I verify that other than asking them? But it sounds like they get a certificate or I can check on the website. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yep. Yeah. Are you GAP? Is your center? Do you
No,
have a
I'm
GAP
thinking that
audit?
they didn't ask us. I mean, we had to have a food safety plan, but we were not asked to provide show that we were GAP
Uh-huh. I mean, you might
certified.
clarify whether or not, like, what specifically they're requiring when it comes to GAP, because there are different GAP audits, right? There's like USDA GAP, harmonized GAP. But then sometimes people make it confusing because they want folks to like verify that they're following food safety practices and they say that it's GAP, but maybe they're just requiring that growers have a food safety plan and they've been to a training.
Mm-hmm.
Not that
Yeah,
they've
like what,
necessarily paid for a third party audit. So,
right? Like I was asked, I'm told, how do you verify that each of the farms you source from follows good agricultural practices or GAP? So
yeah,
then maybe they don't have to participate in a GAP, but they could just show that they have a food safety plan
yeah,
and that their workers follow
that their workers are
are
trained.
trained.
Are
Yeah.
they testing
Mhm.
their water? The Under a GAP audit, um, in particular the harmonized or harmonized GAP plus audit, there's a supplier verification process. So there's a record. If you want to email me, I can send you the record where you ask your supplier. So if you're bringing in produce from other growers, you can ask them to verify that they're following the practices. Um, and then a lot of times folks will have like a spot check process, right? Where you're like going out to farms and checking to make sure that it seems like they're actually, doing good food safety practices on their farm. But I think it's up to you to decide what you need those growers to provide you with, whether it's, copies of their water testing or a food safety plan, that they've participated in some sort of food safety training.
I have a question that I think you you talked about, Sarah, before, that supposedly the produce inspectors, it's free, but it takes time, so it's not really free. And I think something that came out up with McKenna last week is just that when you're having to implement some of these changes, if you're not exempt or if you're trying to do a GAP certification, that it can be operationally challenging because if you're a farmer, if it's the season, growing season, you don't have a ton of time, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
you're having to do something that's potentially outside of your normal growing activities. So, do you have any advice that you give to farmers or that you've experienced of sort of how to integrate in the activities that are needed for some of these certifications or requirements into just running a business?
Yeah. So in addition to the time that's spent like with the actual inspection or audit, right, which is usually just 1 day a year, and can vary depending on how complex your operation is, right, from 2 hours to 8 hours, or more than a day. The areas where we see farmers like having to invest time are related to worker training and record keeping, right? And so there are a lot of resources out there to help growers with worker training. Um, there are videos that have been produced that you can show your employees. We encourage folks to not just have them watch the video, but actually stop and talk about what's covered in the video so that you can ensure that folks understand what's being communicated. Um, Record keeping is often a big issue for farmers. So, if you're already keeping records, like if you're certified organic and you're already keeping your, soil amendment application records, like you don't have to duplicate your records for your GAP audit or your produce safety rule compliance, right? You can use existing records that you're already keeping. Um, Record keeping in general is a good business practice. And so if you're not keeping records, I would encourage everybody to start keeping some records, your sales records, your harvest records, kind of those types of things everybody should be keeping, and you may already be keeping, not specifically for produce safety, but they can also fit into your produce safety record keeping, right? Making sure that records are accessible to the people that need to fill them out. And so whether you do digital records and folks know how to complete those records on their phone or a tablet, or if you have paper records, you know, like keeping the sanitizer level record in the wash stand so that when it's time to check the sanitizer level in the wash water, the record's right there with a pen for somebody to write that down. They don't have to go searching in the office for the record. And then kind of in general, right, I like to encourage farmers to think about how you can incorporate this food safety lens into your operation across all of your activities and really integrate it into your practices so that it's not this add-on thing, right? Which I think a lot of times folks are like, okay, well, I understand soil fertility, I understand integrated pest management, like I know how to manage my workers so that they can harvest and pack produce for, you know, quality control, right? But like all those areas also involve food safety practices. And so just being able to integrate that food safety lens into those activities as you're training workers and working on the farm, I think helps alleviate some of that kind of add-on time burden to food safety.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that was a very good pass at it all. I know it's extremely complicated and it's all very, context specific sometimes. So I really appreciate that. And I think, yeah, your contact information will be shared again. So definitely, maybe if people have questions, they can follow up with you. Thank you for coming, you guys. We will have a follow-up discussion group for both parts of this the food safety sort of series. So I'm just going to post that registration in the chat. If you want to come and just talk about it a little bit more, have some time to maybe talk through some of your specific circumstances. We're not, unfortunately, going to have Sarah or McKenna come back, but it's more of an opportunity to sort of problem solve with each other, maybe share some resources, that kind of thing. So if you think that's valuable to you, definitely join us. But thank you for your time today. Have a good rest of your week. Thank you, Sarah. Everybody, take care of yourself. Keep doing your work.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.